Understanding medieval Japan and its eventual emergence from 200 years of isolation is integral to understanding how that tiny nation rose in the 1930s and 40s to dominate East Asia and the Western Pacific, and then engage in a catastrophic war with the United States during the Second World War. Japan is a very unique nation, and we begin with the Tokugawa shoguns who ruled the island nation from the 1600s until the middle of the 1800s. Japan is actually made up of several hundred islands, but the main islands are Honshu, which is the largest, Kyushu, Shikoku, and Hokkaido. Japanese mythology holds that the islands were vomited from the gods, and the volcanic and earthquake activity of the islands gives some credence to that mythos. Japan is largely mountainous and rocky, and the population there is limited to scarce arable lands, or terraforms the lands for rice farming. The main cities of the Japanese islands are Edo, which is now called Tokyo, and other cities like Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Edo, or Tokyo now, sits under the shadow of the great volcano, Mount Fuji. This is Mount Fuji, which is considered to be one of the great outpouring of the gods. It is a stratovolcano. It's one of the most picturesque standalone volcanoes that you can see. It is not extinct. It is dormant. At some point or other, we know that Fuji is going to erupt. This is a photograph of Mount Fuji taken by the Space Shuttle Columbia on its ill-fated mission in 2003. Here you see an example of terraced rice paddies in Japan using the actual slopes of the mountains to harness the power of the water in which rice grows. The structure of medieval Japan was such that society focused on the person of the emperor, who was considered to be divine, a descendant of the Shimu, the gods of Japan. The emperor ruled from the imperial court in the city of Kyoto, and he had attendees that were called the kujei, or court nobles. Now, while the emperor was considered divine and the official ruler of Japan, the emperors actually exercised very little power over most of their history. Instead, they nominally appointed prime ministers called shoguns. The name shogun means generalissimo and is the short form of Seii Taishogun, which means commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force against the barbarians. And when they referred to the barbarians, they were meaning the Mongols. These shoguns are the ones who actually ruled Japan. They often controlled the emperor as a figurehead and ruled in his stead, although the shoguns themselves could at times be figureheads as well, and lesser lords would rule in their place. And there's a long-standing series of examples in history of this sort of thing happening. So Japan's not unique in this way. Now, since Japan was a feudal state, the large landowners in the country wielded a great deal of power, and they were called daimyo. Daimyo means great name or large land. And these were feudal lords in the sense that, just like European feudalism was. They were the masters of the castle. They were the ones who had the fortress and could protect the peasants. One of the most famous of these was Sakura do Tokyo. Now, eventually, the first shogunate in Japan is called the Ashikaga shogunate, which ruled from 1336 to 1573. And it was marked by a period of strife, civil war, and instability that would lead to another shogunate taking over. When the Ashikaga shogunate collapsed, a powerful daimyo named Oda Nobunaga attempted to unify Japan under a more centralized style of government. However, Nobunaga was attacked by a traitor, forcing him and his son to commit seppuku, which is a ritual suicide that involves you literally taking a short sword and disemboweling yourself. However, one of Nobunaga's retainers, a peasant-born administrator named Hideyoshi, takes the name Toyotomi and proceeds to complete the unification of Japan. Now, as with all new and somewhat insecure rulers, he turned to military conquest abroad to validate his rule. So he tries to conquer Korea and Ming China. But as our friend Vizzini in The Princess Bride once opined, never start a land war in Asia, he was unsuccessful in this and had to come home. Later on in his life, as Toyotomi's health was beginning to fail, he realized that his son was too young still to rule. So he appointed what was called a Council of Five Regents. And one of the five regents was one of his military generals, and his name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu then begins to make military alliances with daimyo who were opposed to Toyotomi. Now, one of the other four regents died very early, and then Ieyasu killed the other three regents, as well as Hideyoshi's son and nephew. And thus, with power completely in his control, Ieyasu receives the title of shogun from the emperor and establishes the Tokugawa shogunate and makes his capital the city of Edo, which is now called Tokyo. Again, as with all new rulers whose legitimacy is somewhat suspect, Ieyasu imposed a ruthless efficiency on his realm. He was not well liked, but he was feared, and he was respected for his loyalty to his supporters and his vengeance on those who did him wrong. He was, though, simply a creature of the times, and the times included violence, sudden death, and betrayal. He just did it better than the others. Ieyasu secures all arable land and port cities and puts them under his absolute rule. And in a brilliant move, he mandates that the daimyo spend part of their time at his new palace, which he builds in Edo. He adheres to the principle of the Godfather. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. He also creates a secret police to spy on and to harass potential threats, potential rivals. And he trained his own son to rule while he was still alive, so as to effect a smooth transition of power after his death. Hideyoshi Toyotomi, while he was ruling in Japan, undertook a series of public building campaigns. He built Osaka Castle with its main tower, which is a replica of the original, and then in the lower right you see the moat. And this is where later Tokugawa Ieyasu would invade by filling that moat with sand and capturing the son of Toyotomi and forcing him and his mother to commit suicide. Japan is well known for its ornate towers that function also as residences or storerooms as well. This is the Fujimi Yagura, which is a turret of the castle in Edo, which was built in the year 1659. Eventually, the castle in Edo became the imperial city of the emperors in Tokyo. This is the great main bridge into the palace of Edo, which is now the imperial city. This was built after the Meiji Restoration in the year 1868 that replaced the old wooden bridge. Japanese are not allowed to cross this bridge. No one is allowed to cross this bridge except on 2 days, one of which is the emperor's birthday. This is the tomb of Tokugawa Ieyasu in Nikko Tosho-gu. Japanese religion originally had two facets. The imperial city of Tokyo. Now, unlike the imperial city of Beijing, while the other was the philosophical, metaphysical devotion of Zen imperial Buddhism. City in Tokyo now, Shinto is more of the indigenous religion of Japan, almost like and revolves around the polytheistic worship of all that kami, with the exception of the supernatural forces that animate all things. But it's not This is
of the
where the
scale
term
or the
kamikaze
magnificence
comes
of
from.
what you see in
These
Beijing, near
supernatural
Tiananmen Square.
deities or forces are honored at public and private shrines marked by ornate and decorative gates. As I said, it is more of a civic religion designed to invoke harmony in society, to bring society together. And for those who do not quite understand what a civic religion is, well, just consider the fact that we all like to dress up in red, white, and blue, sacrifice meats like burgers and hot dogs, and have mattress sales on national holidays. And that can give you an example of what civic religion is all about. Now, the other religion of Japan is Zen Buddhism, which coexists alongside Shinto, much the same way Islam and Hinduism coexisted under the Mughals. Zen derives its name from the Chinese Shan and focuses largely on the discipline of the mind through meditation, chanting, and rituals, as well as such esoteric contemplations like, for instance, if a branch falls from a tree in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? These are the things that you contemplate and focus on to calm the mind. Now, the Tokugawas at first were tolerant of Christianity, which they called Kirishitan, when it arrived in Japan with the Portuguese in the 1500s. Christianity was introduced by the Jesuits, led by Francis Xavier, and then the Dominicans and Franciscans followed when the Spanish arrived. Christianity in Japan was practiced as a variation of Buddhist philosophy, and it was actually the Jesuits who made this possible. And there are several Jesuits, by the way, who are Zen masters even to this day. Now, the Dominicans and the Franciscans were more strident in their orthodoxy, and they demanded that the Christians in Japan adhere more strongly to the Roman rites, which at times tended to alienate the Japanese. And this caused a backlash by the shoguns, because the Japanese are an incredibly proud, almost arrogant people as a collective whole, and believe themselves to be the top dogs in civilization, as many do. And of course, here come the Europeans saying that we're the top dogs in civilization. And so the shoguns see Christianity as a threat to the social order and to the stability of the shogunate. Christian intolerance also grew when the shoguns begin to see missionary work as a form of European imperialism. Thus, Ieyasu set into law a series of codes that required all Japanese eventually to renounce Christianity on pain of death, and the type of death was crucifixion. You want to be like Jesus? Then go all the way, says Ieyasu. In addition, the shoguns begin a massive oppression of Christianity, driving the church underground for more than 200 years, but not wiping it out completely. They were unable to do that, and when Japan reopened in the 1860s, they found Christian communities that had survived, even without priests, even without formal worship ceremonies. There were Christian communities that had remained within Japan. Now, the ban of Christianity is often linked with the creation of the seclusion laws, or sakoku, in the 1630s, as the shoguns begin to try and shut out the world. Now, the problem was simple. There was a great deal of Western influence that the shoguns were growing very sick and tired of, but also Japan, being an island nation, was prone to raids by pirates and piracy. And the shoguns attempted to get a hold on this. And so what they do is they institute a ban on traders from the West that lasted 214 years. In 1636, an edict was issued by the shoguns prohibiting Japanese from leaving the country. And not only did it do that, it also said that Japanese who were already outside the country were not allowed to return, saying that they would come and be infected with Western ideals. Japan was not totally isolated, though. Dutch and Chinese traders were allowed the use of an island off the port of a city called Nagasaki, while some peripheral ports were open to limited traffic. So Japan was not completely shut off, but it was largely shut off, and it would not be reopened again until the year 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, under orders from Franklin Pierce and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, sails into Tokyo Bay and points his guns at the shoguns and say, "You're going to open up or else." This is called a torii, or a gate, and this is the gateway to the Itsukushima Shrine in Japan. Now, torii mark the entrance to Shinto shrines and can be found all around Japan and are recognizable symbols of the religion. The Itsukushima Shrine is located in another rather interesting city, Hiroshima. This is an artist's depiction of Japanese Christians who were crucified by the shogunate in the 1600s. Despite this very public execution, and crucifixion is a very painful form of death, the Christian community would not die in Japan. Japan followed a very rigid feudal order, and had a hereditary social class with the daimyo at the top. There was also a farmer class, which of course meant the most numerous group of people in Japan, and they were followed by the artisans and the merchants. Now, the hereditary military nobility of Japan were, of course, the samurai, which we're all familiar with samurai in some form or other. Now, who were the samurai? They were allowed to carry two swords, which was a special privilege in Japan, and cultivated the code of the Bushido, or the code of the warrior. And this meant indifference to pain, unflinching loyalty, and proper etiquette, proper behavior, much like a Christian knight would be. They wore distinctive clothing. They had distinctive haircuts and became the protectors of the feudal lords, vowing to avenge their masters if defeated, and then once they avenged their masters, then they would commit ritual suicide. Samurai who had no feudal lord were called ronin, and they shaved their heads, and they would go in search of a master, or they would go in search of recovering their honor in some way. They were forbidden from manual labor, the samurai that is, and were paid in rice. Now, Japan is largely a rural society. The farmers are peasants. They're not serfs, so they're not completely feudal. In other words, they have their own land. They own their own fields. They rely on the lord for protection. They certainly relied on the daimyo for protection, and they certainly paid fees for that. But they were the ones who were the masters of their own land. What you see in Japan are a large number of villages. Japanese on these lands, of course, raised rice, which is, of course, the bread of East Asia. They also raised wheat and barley, and Japanese beer and Japanese sake and other forms of Japanese alcohol were very abundant. They also grew things like hemp, which is important in the making of rope, cotton, and mulberry. And this way you had famous Japanese silk. This armor here is called a hatomunda. This comes from the 16th century. It is the historic armor once used by Kenshin Uesugi, who was one of the most powerful daimyos of the Sengoku period. Daimyos could also be samurai, and sometimes samurai could rise to become daimyos. This beautiful structure is called the Himeji Castle. It was built in 1333 by the samurai Akamatsu Norimura of the Akamatsu clan. In 1954, famous Japanese director Akira Kurosawa directed the epic samurai drama film called The Seven Samurai. The story takes place in the year 1586 during the Sengoku period of Japanese history. It follows the story of a village of farmers that hire 7 ronin, who are the masterless samurai, to combat bandits who will return after the harvest to steal their crops. The movie stars leading actor Toshiro Mifune, seen in the photo in front of the others and carrying a sword, who is basically a Japanese version of Brad Pitt, Harrison Ford, and Johnny Depp all rolled into one. Now, if you have not seen this film, shame on you, especially if you have seen its Western adaptations, The Magnificent Seven, filmed by John Sturges in 1960, and starring Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen and Charles Bronson and James Coburn, among others, and its remake in 2016 with Denzel Washington, Ethan Hawke, and Chris Pratt, which is, okay, it was a good adaptation, but, it does not measure up to the original. Please make it a point to watch The Seven Samurai at some point. Even in feudal Japan, arable land was so scarce and population growth presented such a problem that the Japanese practiced mabiki, which means the thinning. This was the infanticide of females. They also practiced abortion, and this could provide some form of population control before the Tokugawas began a program of relief and government subsidy for families. The Japanese also viewed prostitution in a much different way than Westerners did. Prostitution was a form of social mobility for women in society. It provided education for women, but it was regulated during the Edo period and kept to the periphery in town pleasure quarters, or what we would call red light districts today. In Japanese society, there was also a strong division between towns and farms. As in most cultures, people of the towns tend to look down on the farmers, and in reverse, the farmers would then look at the townspeople as being immoral, unstable, corrupt, and so forth. Now, the Shinto civic religion provided the Japanese with numerous festivals with floats and competitions like sumo wrestling. Perhaps the most interesting form of Japanese entertainment is called kabuki. Kabuki is Japanese theater, which was a combination of dance and drama, and known for its heavily stylized performances, the often glamorous costumes worn by the performers, and for the elaborate makeup called kumadori that is worn by the performers. Now, as with all great cultures, pilgrimages mark the culture of Japan. As with the Christians with Rome or Israel and Palestine, or the Muslims with Mecca, pilgrimages in Japan focus on the great shrine in the city of Ise, and this shrine is dedicated to the goddess Amaterasu. This is a photograph of the great shrine of Jingu at Ise, which is, of course, the focus of these pilgrimages. The shrine encompasses two major shrines, which is called the inner one, the Naiku, and the outer one, the Gekku. Between them are the Oharai Mashi and the Okage Yokocho alleys, I'll get that right, lined with buildings reminiscent of Japan's Edo and Meiji periods. It now houses shops and restaurants. There are more than 100 smaller shrines in the city as well. This is the Naiku shrine in Ise, which no one is allowed to actually go into, but can circle around and visit. And it's not so much a place where you offer prayers as you simply visit and walk around and maybe meditate a little bit. It's more a place where the gods speak to you rather than you speak to the gods. And what you'll notice if you ever go to Ise is you'll notice a large number of chickens walking around on the pavement. The chickens are supposedly representatives of the goddess Amaterasu, and so when they're clucking, that's Amaterasu actually speaking to you. So what we've seen here is that Japan is a very complex and sophisticated